Great. Thank you so much. And I want to do a welcome to everyone who's joining us on Zoom, and also hello to Facebook Live. I'm Elizabeth Cruz. I work for the Participatory Budgeting Project. I'm the Director of Democracy Beyond Elections at PBP. This is the second in a series of discussions where we hope to engage partners in conversation around key issues of justice and participatory democracy practices. So we have a wonderful panel here, and we're going to jump into our discussion now. So Cyndi, I'm going to start with you. In Phoenix, there's been such strong youth PB for the last 3 years, and you were able to do what so many young people and school leaders across the country are calling for in this moment this year. And that's removing police from our school and reinvesting that money into a PB process. So can you talk about the groundwork that you've laid over the past several years that allowed for this kind of visionary reclamation of safety in schools to be possible? And how have you seen youth leadership emerge and grow in the last 3 years?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's really exciting times in Phoenix Union. We launched the participatory budgeting process in 2013, really started as a pilot, and it was with a principal's a very small portion of his discretionary budget. It's at a small specialty school, so it really allowed us to kind of get a feel for how this would work in a school setting. That same school year, our governing board enacted a civic engagement resolution, and the goal of the resolution was to increase voter registration and to provide civic engagement opportunities for students. And so at that same time, I was, learning about the process, and we thought this is such a perfect way to do both of those things, right? This is a way to allow students to learn democracy by doing. It's all about civic engagement, but it also provided a vehicle to amplify student voice, build agency, and to build leadership capacity. So we started in 5 schools, and every year have continued to add those schools to district-wide last year at 20 of our high schools. What's really been exciting along the way is there's definitely been some challenges and some learnings, but there's also been some incredible, what I call unintended consequences. I think folks initially at a time in Phoenix when school funding was a really big issue. Some of you may have heard of Red for Ed. We had teachers and staff basically walk out and strike because of school funding. And so simultaneously where it was being approached with questions about, isn't this irresponsible, right? You're giving a portion of your budget when funding is so low to students to decide on school improvements. And while I knew, because I've worked with young people for so long, that we really just needed to trust their judgment and allow students to make those decisions, because they use and experience our campuses in a way that they really are the expert of where improvements need to be made. But others needed to see and learn that. And I think folks were so surprised with the thoughtfulness, the work, how dedicated they were to this process, and how responsible their decisions were, that it really kind of just, when I talk about transformational change, it created this culture where our leaders were going to students to get opinions on even, we're going to paint the school. So we didn't use a whole PB process, but it allows students to decide what colors they wanted the campus to be. We talked about, they were going to redo a construction of a cafeteria. They allowed students, because now students, once they got a taste of having and being at the decision-making table, they wanted to have a say in what that cafeteria was going to look like. So we actually allowed them to meet with the architectures and be involved in designing the cafeteria, since they were the ones who were going to use this space. And so it really just created this culture where people understood that our students were becoming very responsible risk takers. They were feeling empowered to ask questions. They were feeling empowered to offer ideas of what they needed. And more importantly, they were becoming so socially conscious that they wanted to make changes, not only in their school community, but surrounding community. So we saw instances where students were visiting the legislature, going to city council meetings. Once they understood that they had a voice at school, they wanted to make changes in their community as well. And I think that just led us to this moment where we had, I think people have seen what's happening in Phoenix as a whole, and there's a lot of media attention about our Phoenix police being the most violent. And so students wanted to talk about, why are we spending all of this money? Why are there not other options being brought to us? And why can't we have a voice in what we need for our schools? And it just came down to a point where actually I got a phone call from our superintendent one evening, and it was, what do you think about using this process to allow students and our stakeholders to decide what school safety should look like? And I mean, how could we say no? I mean, I just think it's the right thing to do. I think it's the right time for us. What I'm really excited about is we will be running 3 simultaneous process. So I thought it was important that students have their own space. So they will continue, and they will have their own allocation budget to talk about what does school safety look like and define it. Our staff will have their own process. So it's just staff of all classified support staff, teachers, and admin. And then a separate space for our parents and guardians to really have a voice in this and define what do they want school safety to look like for them. And I think I'm more excited about the parent and guardian, because this is a group who oftentimes is marginalized. They don't have spaces. Our campuses sometimes aren't open when they want to have that voice. And so really thinking about how we're engaging our parents to not only define school safety, but to talk about like family and community engagement. With my new title being family and community engagement, we're working on our strategic plan. One of the pillars of family and community engagement is involving parents in decision-making, governance, and advocacy. And I just feel like this is the perfect vehicle to allow our parents to build all of those skills, but again, to sit at the table and help us define what they need from us.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Cyndi.
You're welcome.
Ryan, so you're coming from a slightly different angle. So you're coming from an elected official's office that chose to share power with students and enable them to make decisions about things that affect their lives. Can you talk about why you wanted to do it, why it was important, and how this kind of came about and what you learned?
Sure. So excuse me. So prior to engaging in the school-based participatory budgeting process, the borough president in 2000, I think it was 2016, became the first elected official or agency outside of the New York City Council to engage in participatory budgeting. And we did that through our capital budget process, where we were able to kick in additional resources to Brooklyn council members that were participating in this process. And we did it, 1, because we thought it was the right thing to do, and 2, because we thought it would be a great way to get more elected officials involved in this by leveraging existing capital resources that we have access to. The way that the borough presidencies are set up versus vis-a-vis the council members is that borough presidents are very, very capital heavy. So we have a lot of, our capital budget can range to, the lowest it's ever been was 15 million a year in our first year in office. And the highest it was $100 million a year. So, so it usually varies, levels are out around 30 million for what we have. When you take a look at council members, that budget is much, much lower. It's about 5 million total for a councilmanic district. So what we decided to do is that we don't have resources like expense funding. They have more expense funding than the borough presidencies to run a process ourselves. So what we decided to do was allocate our significant capital resources to leverage what they were already putting in from a capital side and leverage the process that existed. We thought it was a great way to empower young people during the council process. But when Josh Werner from Participatory Budgeting Project came to us and came to me and said, we want to do a different model, we want to show that this can be done in different settings, the borough president was in 100%, and particularly because it engaged young people. We view this as an incredible opportunity for young people that are coming from primarily marginalized communities, to empower them to engage in the small d democratic process and get them training in thinking about how engagement in civic affairs, engagement with government, engagement with budgets can really shape how they can change their communities. And the first year we did 2 campuses. We did John Jay campus in Park Slope, and Gotham Arts Academy in Crown Heights. And what we found was just absolutely amazing that these young people were so well versed in the democratic process after the process had gone through. We were sitting down and having these meetings with the students, and the borough president was just absolutely gobsmacked and blown away about how engaged these young people had become, and more importantly, from our perspective, what types of projects that they selected. You know, Elizabeth mentioned earlier that some of the capital projects included, water fountains. They selected, rehabbing bathrooms to be gender neutral. They selected, the rehabilitation of the basketball court. What they were selecting were projects that made them feel safe by breaking down the silos of these different types of campuses. These campus schools are often 5 schools in one building, but they don't interact with one another. And what they were doing, they were creating safe public spaces or private spaces in the sense of the bathrooms, but spaces that they felt that needed to be safer for them and that they could be used to congregate in and engage one another. And I think it was really telling that continued throughout even the second iteration of the participatory budgeting process at schools, was where they wanted to create more accessible spaces. The bathrooms that they decided to fund were specifically chosen to improve wheelchair accessibility. So these young people were thinking completely outside the box in terms of what safety meant for them. And a lot of what it meant was there are access and places for them to engage one another in a productive manner. And that's something that we love to see in our young people, because it translates into our communities, as Cyndi was talking about. And what we loved about this particular year is that despite the process getting a little bit upended because of COVID, we were able to continue to have the vote remotely, and it engaged administrators and parents in the voting process as well. And we were thrilled to be able to see that happen. And it's something that we're looking to continue and spread even further across the borough and New York City.
That's amazing. Thank you. Francesco, we've heard Ryan and Cyndi talk about the importance of youth voice, but this is something that you've done for a lot of your life, first as a student and then at PBP, now you're at Coro, working to partner students with elected officials to get them involved in the process. Can you talk about why it's so important to give youth real decision-making power and kind of how you've done that in your work?
Yeah. As I think about the different projects I've worked on, I think a common strand and a common thread that I see is being able to really create authentic opportunities for young people to step into their leadership. There probably isn't a school or a school district that doesn't claim to involve young people in decision making. I think we often see that in the form of focus groups. Sometimes there may be a student member on the school committee that may or may not have voting rights, the same voting rights that other community members do. But I think it's really, really integral to actually create a space for young people to step into and to have them hold real responsibility. Otherwise, a lot of that growth doesn't happen. And also you're missing out on a lot of the expertise that young people bring with them. And so when I think about the vehicle that participatory budgeting offers, I think the container is so powerful because it gives folks access to a lot of resources that are kind of hard for folks to wrap their minds around at first, adults or young people, right? When we talk about putting $1 million into the hands of residents, it sounds like a lot, because to an average person, $1 million is a ton of money. It would change people's lives. For a city, for a school district, sometimes that's not the case. Sometimes $1 million is a drop in the bucket. Sometimes we're talking about tens of millions. And especially in a city like New York, where the PB process decides over $40 million, it certainly seems like a lot of responsibility to take on. certainly more responsibility than most folks have had in their life. So for the authentic engagement to take place, I think starting young is the best way to do it. You don't suddenly turn 18, or you don't suddenly turn 25 or 30 or 40 and then know how to do things because you've turned that age. Everything in your life comes from practice. And so being able to expose young people and put them into positions of power where they have to negotiate, where they have to consider, where they have to empathize with folks, I think builds some really, really strong muscles from a really young age, and builds behaviors to get folks sort of prepared for a whole life of those types of behaviors. So at Coro, one of the things that we're really excited to do more recently is not just engage young people in participatory budgeting, but really think about the different stratas that exist in terms of increasing responsibility for young people that know what they're doing. And so while we usually do train young people during the summer, what we did this past summer because of COVID is extend the fellowship for certain young people for them to really uncover and start to engineer the new ways to continue to do PB in this moment. And it's something I'm really happy to share with folks about what we did. But I just want to pause for a second and really just, again, say the fact that PB offers young people a real seat at the table speaks volumes to the folks who do it. A lot of times we talk about PB as something that builds trust in government, but what I've found is that more often than not, it's a new way for elected officials, for superintendents to really trust the residents that they serve, to really put trust in young people that they do know what they're doing, that they will take it seriously and are actually the best folks to make these decisions.
That's amazing. Thank you all so much. So just a reminder, if you have any questions, please put them, if you're on Zoom, put them in the Zoom chat. If you're on Facebook Live, put them in the comments. I do have one question that's come from the Zoom is, in what role do educators in education unions play in this process? Cyndi, do you want to take this one?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first I'll start off by saying that I am an educator. I've been with Phoenix Union High School District. Again, I'll say that, I'm sorry to repeat it, but for 28 years. Actually worked in all of the ranks. Longtime union member. I was vice president of our local. So some union languages, if you're vice president of your local, I was on the board of directors for our state agency and a leader within the national organization, NEA, and spoke on their behalf and was on several committees and traveled throughout representing NEA and Arizona. I currently am as an administrator in our admin union. So we don't belong to our local with teachers and staff. It's a separate union, but I have always been a strong union supporter. I think that in Phoenix Union, because we have such large unions, we always also just make sure that when we're including voice, it typically was the voice of union members, which is great. I think what participatory budgeting process allows us to do is include the voice of everyone, those who are members, those who are not members, and in this case, including the voice of students, parents, guardians, and community members. I think that for anything to be successful when you're talking about in that education landscape, you need to make sure that you are working closely with your unions. It just helps with supporting. They have some great ideas. Union leaders are also just really good allies to help kind of build and create that excitement and bring people to the table. So I don't know if that answers your questions, Lynn, about the union piece of it, but I can talk more about that specifically. And then I don't know how familiar you are with Arizona, but we have different locals. We have one for our support staff, one for admin, and then one for teachers. And so really it is working with all of them collaboratively. And again, because students and parents don't belong to those unions, how do we amplify the voice of students and parents? Because as much as we as educators are the ones who are running the show, if we don't include the voice of students and parents, again, they're the primary stakeholders. And so it's really about making sure that we can all come together and decide whatever it is that we're deciding, whether it's curriculum, safe schools, school improvement, committee work. It's just one of those areas, again, where everybody needs to be involved. But if you have more questions or if I didn't answer that, please go ahead and put them in chat and I'll make sure to be more specific.
Can I add a little bit to that, Cyndi?
Yeah,
Absolutely.
absolutely.
I think the other part of it is like, I get in trouble for saying this, but like I think PB is the concept is pretty simple. It's not a technically hard thing to do, right? You have a list of items you want to prioritize, and you have a vote to do them. And usually that determines what the budget is. I think the hard part that we project onto PB is all the relationship building that's necessary in order to do it really, really well. A PB process that I run is going to be different than one that Ryan runs, is going to be different than one that Cyndi runs, not because we have a different understanding of what PB is, but because the way we build relationships, the way we want to bring people together, the way we want them to negotiate and interact with each other during the different phases of this community making decision is different. And I think when we talk about PB in schools, it's hard to underestimate the life that a teacher really brings to a PB process. It's really hard to underestimate the style and the influence and just the feel of the space that the teacher holds with young people. And so while Cyndi and I and other folks can certainly provide a solid framework that everyone could work from, it's the teacher and the educators that really bridge the relationship between the theoretical concept of participatory budgeting and how it feels to actually go through it.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing that Francesco just said. Just the point of entry for engaging young people as an outside entity, as an outside agency that the borough president is through the educators and the administrators that are willing to sort of break the mold and think about outside the box on how to engage young people in this process. We don't have direct access to young people in schools, and that's just the way the system is set up. And in order to be able to break into that system, we have to have those the educators that are willing to kind of to be those sort of innovators in thinking and bridge, as Francesco aptly said, bridge the two entities, the capital in this case to the actual process in the schools. And without the educators, without the unions that are willing to be a part of that, it's impossible for us as an outside elected official or agency to make that happen. It would have to go through the layers and layers of bureaucracy at an institution that is often very hesitant to change. I'm not saying the DOE is hesitant to change. I'm saying big institutions don't like a lot of radical change. And make no mistake about it, PB is a radical idea in a lot of circles, just to empower young people to decide what they want to fund is mind-blowing to a lot of adults. And I think it's finding those educators and those members in the union that are willing to take a chance and see what can happen when we think a little bit innovatively.
And if I can just add a little bit more to that, Phoenix Union is a very large, we're about 28,000 square miles. We have 20 schools, and we're a high school district only. So we have 13 partner districts that feed into Phoenix Union. All of our schools are very different. So I think when you think about participatory budgeting, it's really thinking about the process and the goals of the process and the framework. But the reality is, even in each school, it might look a little bit different. The process also might look a little bit different depending on the complex issues that you're discussing, right? So we are transitioning from about 5 years of implementing participatory budgeting to decide on school improvement with capital funds, to now this participatory budgeting process. It's really about safe schools and using monies that we're divesting from school resource officer budget to allowing our stakeholders to reimagine school safety. This process also is going to look and feel a little bit different. The beauty of participatory budgeting is no matter what setting you're in, whether it's an elementary school, a high school, a municipality, even an organization or corporation, the process can work. You define the principles and then you help it fit into your culture, your system, and maybe even sometimes your language. But that's one of the things that I love about participatory budgeting. It can be something very simple, school improvement, where we're deciding on school misting systems, library upgrades, restroom upgrades, all of those things that are really important for students to experience their campus, but also a really complex issue like school safety, right? And what does that look like for us? So I just wanted to share that to make sure that folks weren't thinking that it was really a one-size-fits-all approach. It's a process that can be used in any setting. And the more people you have at the table, the more successful. It's really about inclusion and diversity. And so all stakeholders matter when it comes to participatory budgeting.
Amazing. One thing I want to add that I mentioned at the beginning is that normally in these conversations, we would really want to have a youth voice or a student who's been through this process present. And we just found that with school starting up and everything that was going on, we just weren't able to do that. So this is a second of a conversation in the series. So we're really hoping to do a panel discussion that will engage youth and students more directly. So just wanted to put that out there. Another question from the Zoom. So if a high school student was interested in starting the conversation of PB in their school district, what first steps would you recommend? And I'll add my own question on top of that. So what are the conditions that need to be in place to successfully advocate for and implement PB in schools? Whoever wants to jump in.
I'll take a stab at that. I think for a student to bring this forward, there's multiple ways you can do that. Approaching your campus admins or your principal or a club sponsor, even just talking to a teacher and making sure that that suggestion gets elevated. As far as thinking about what principles need to be in place, I think it depends on what you're talking about. I've always encouraged schools who have come forward to me to talk about how can we start this? It might just be being included in some decision-making. So participatory decision-making practices, right? But if you really, really have some ideas about school improvement or school safety, if you could also talk to a governing board member, that also really helps. That was one of the ways that we got this initially launched in Phoenix Union. We definitely had a superintendent that was very much in favor of elevating student voice, but we had some board members who were really supportive of the process, because for us, it's about allocating those budgets. And when it comes to school budgets, your governing board is really involved in that. So I would just have an idea of what you're talking about. Do you, is it for school improvement? Do you need a budget? Can it just be starting off with having a seat at the table? Are you talking about a campus, a club, or campus-wide, district-wide? Don't be afraid to start small and grow the process, because sometimes it's the grown-ups and the adults that are a little bit more fearful about giving so much power away to our students. But once they see the value of that, they will be very interested.
Can I just jump in and add, I would add, I echo everything that Cyndi said about our students reaching out to admin, but they should also be reaching out to their elected officials. We love to have input from young people. The borough president talks often about how, especially in the time of Black Lives Matter right now, seeing the winds of change be blown by our young people is just something that happens in every generation. And what we need to is make those connections between young people and the elected officials that are in power. So I would just echo everything that Cyndi said, but also making sure that they're reaching out to and not hesitant to reach out to their elected officials. We're representing them as well. With respect to what types of schools we have historically selected, it's been much more of a top-down selection process of identifying certain traits in schools. We wanted to focus on large campus schools that had multiple schools on campuses, because we wanted to see how we could sort of create a new vision for safety amongst schools that don't interact with one another often. However, this year we're actually going to do something a little bit different. My capital budget director, Candace Julian, is on, and she came up with a wonderful idea. We do sort of trainings in the fall, or presentations in the fall, about how to apply for capital funding. One of the things that we're interested in pursuing this year is sort of an option of who would be interested in participating in a school safety participatory budgeting process, adding that into and having schools self-select themselves a little bit and, grow that out a little bit further. So shout out to Candace for that wonderful idea that we talked about the other day.
Francesco, anything to add about the conditions that need to be in place for successful PB implementation?
I mean, I just want to say to Ryan real quick, make sure like one of the questions you ask is how much of your budget are you willing to put up to be a part of the process too?
Yep,
Because
Yes.
they got some
absolutely.
operating for us to do.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's like Cyndi said, you just need a pot of money and some people to help you decide what to do with it. And it could be, you can start with $20, right? I don't know. I think the interest, I mean, the story I hear from Phoenix, Cyndi, is that it started in one classroom with one teacher just doing it. Maybe had some support from the principal, and then the next year it was in 5 schools, then 10 schools, and 17 school like campuses. So for sure, like just start doing it. The thing about participatory budgeting is the more you do it, the better you get at it. And so if you start with something and then you're like, oh, this is how we do idea collection. Oh, this is how we could vote. And have it be a proven thing that's possible, then I think that helps convince some of the adults who are reluctant or who maybe don't think it's actually possible, but say, look, we just did it. We just need some more funding now so more people could participate. It's certainly a exercise in organizing. I'm not an organizer, so I couldn't give you the best advice on how to go about that, but I feel like that's how I've seen some really successful processes take root. If you are able to do some power mapping and have some ins with elected officials or decision makers, that's another pretty easy way to get your hands on a pot of money. But that's the hardest part, the pot of money. The other stuff after that is a little easier.
Amazing.
One more thing, Elizabeth, that I'll share is sometimes it's not even about identifying a new pot of money. So if there's a pot of money that you are aware of or you can figure out, it's about how can we be involved in deciding how that money gets spent. And so I'm just trying to think of like if it has to do with clubs or school safety or after school programs or any of those types of things that you're really interested in or are passionate about, start there. They don't have to come up with new money, but how can we as students be involved in deciding how those funds are spent?
Yeah, and I mean, every year, no matter what happens in New York City, council members and borough presidents have capital funding and they have expense funding. So it's not a matter of it being new money. It's just a matter of like, oh, how we were going to prioritize using these resources in a different way.
Amazing. Thank you. We have a couple of questions from Facebook. We see Facebook. And that is, how are students leading a citywide conversation about public safety outside of schools? And then another one, would love to hear how panelists approach creating the context necessary to create change. So.
Where can I see these questions?
Sorry, they're on the Facebook live stream. I'll go ahead and repeat them. So one is, how are students leading a citywide conversation about public safety outside of schools? So if you are aware of any kind of context around outside of schools, and would love to hear how panelists approach creating the context necessary to create change.
So I could take the first part of that at least. I know when we are seeing, as I mentioned earlier, the young people sort of leading the charge in the Black Lives Matter movement is integral. These are not sort of the old guard civil rights leaders that are fostering the change. It's young people, and the borough president has engaged them, and he's spoken with them, he shared his experiences, but he's looking to them to sort of lead that conversation around public safety and police reform. More locally, and this is not citywide, but what we have done at Borough Hall is we have appointees on the community board, and we reserve spots for young people 16 and above, 16 to 18, for people to become engaged locally in civic engagement at the local level. So what we want to see more young people on our community board level, in our affecting change locally, and then having that grow to a more citywide approach. But we think that community board participation, our neighborhood advisory boards are all these different entities that have that young people can have roles in shaping the narrative and shaping change.
And I'll talk about a couple of things. So the context necessary to create the change. I think there's a few things that you need to consider. Number one, I think it's really important to have somebody not only at a school level, if we're talking about in education, and that's my expertise, so I'm going to relay it to that context. Somebody at the school to help lead this and serve as the I'll say sponsor. We call it our PB sponsor, who helps guide and facilitate the work with the students at the campus level. But it's really important to have somebody at the district level who's really championing the idea, keeping it alive, advocating for those funds and guiding principles, keeping the conversation of participatory budgeting in front of the superintendent and governing board members. So it's not something that's happening off in the distant and people aren't aware of. We need to be aware of it and hear the stories and make sure that they receive data, like how many students submitted an idea, how many, all of that, those types of data points are really important. Educators love data points, our administrators do. The other thing I would say is really important when you think about school budgets, the principals don't have as much power over their school budget as some would think. It really is, a lot of it is decided at the district level. So curriculum oversees the budget and gives the campus the curriculum budget that they need. M&O is a big portion of that, and that's all of your staffing. The capital funding for school improvement, a lot of that happens at the district level, and then principals have a little bit of authority to talk about what improvements are they proposing, but there's a lot of district stuff happening. Where there is a real opportunity to bring forward an idea and create an excitement about implementing or help with the why should we implement participatory budgeting is being familiar with your district's strategic plan and finding areas where it aligns with the strategic plan, and then also being really familiar with school finance. So all school districts receive money out of Title I. There are 2 requirements in Title I where I continue to align our participatory budgeting language to the Title I requirements. And so 2 requirements in Title I where I believe it fully aligns is there is a parent engagement component. And so I always will talk about language of where this aligns to those things in our strategic plan. But there's also a requirement for culture and climate. And when you think about participatory budgeting and just the things that I shared earlier, like some of those unintended consequences, we implemented participatory budgeting to provide civic engagement opportunities and elevate student voice, but it was really the power of the relationships that were happening, both amongst students having relationships with their peers, but also with staff, school connectedness, just creating this very different culture of inclusion, and students wanted to be involved in school and have a voice and show up and ask questions. Very much is aligned with Title I funding. So I would just say, look for those things, be familiar with your strategic plan, become familiar with budgets and what areas you can align, why it would be important to utilize this process, and what pockets of money would be a good idea to use a process to help them with creating ideas of how to spend the money. And then in regards to the first part of the question, how is this happening at the city level? As I have, had quite a few years, about 4 years working with participatory budgeting, every year I would learn things and try to, and really kind of shift the way we were implementing it or adding things to our workshops. My goal was to create an environment where even our voting felt like a real life polling station. While we were allocating funds, we were also in Arizona electing a new Maricopa County recorder. I donated to his campaign. I walked for his campaign, but I also said in the beginning, I need your help. If you win, this is what I want from you. And so he allowed us to use real polling booths, actual ballots that we use in our federal election and local election, and vote machines. And so it was wanting to create this space where students knew what it was going to feel like to go in and vote. They also had to show their ID. We just created all of the requirements for that. We also, I knew that when you think about campaigning, right? So students come up with these ideas, they workshop their ideas and they build formal proposals. Then it's really about, as somebody who works with a lot of organizing organizations, I always wanted it to kind of have that same language. So I partnered with one of the largest organizing groups in Arizona, One Arizona. There's 13 agencies that are doing a lot of the work around here. You hear about them, ACE and Lucha, Mi Familia Vota. I brought them in and we really worked on a a campaign training that was all focused around organizing. And so when you talk about having house parties or tabling or doing these works, we shifted our participatory budgeting language to mirror that. And we had the organizers train the students to really focus on that campaigning and presentations and knocking on doors. So instead of knocking on doors to get out the vote effort, they were doing presentations and knocking on classroom advisories to do presentations. They did a lot of those types of things. And so I think that empowered a lot of our students to also join and become student leaders within a lot of these organizations who are doing a lot of work in Phoenix. They're the ones, if you've been able to see the news, who are at the city council demanding accountability for our police. They did organize a walk about school safety, and they've just been very vocal. They have really been empowered to use their voice. They come to board meetings, they speak, they go to city council and they speak. And so, maybe not everybody thinks that that's great, but I think when you see a young person who wants to be involved and wants to have a voice as adults, like how can we not listen to them? How can we not bring them to the table and help us resolve those issues? So there's a lot of things happening outside of school. And when I talked about this being able to experience participatory budgeting and the skills that they bring, that social consciousness isn't just to impact their school. These are life skills that they're taking into their life and deciding that they want to have a voice in their community as well.
That's amazing. Francesco and Ryan, anything to add on this one?
I got something quick for the context setting. I think the important part, I have some stuff for the citywide stuff too, but just one of the practices that I learned from PBP is making sure that we ground every process and design it with community. And part of that design process is saying, what goals? What are we doing this for? What are we actually doing this for? Why are we doing this PB process? We're doing it for fun, we're doing it for other reasons. And I've seen some really cool goals come out of this we just want neighbors to meet their neighbors. We want young people to have more power in the city. We want folks who are a part of these marginalized communities to be overrepresented in the process. We want to create pathways to leadership for community members. And I think having just an honest conversation about what everyone's here for, and then what we did recently is have some young researchers take those goals, turn them into like some smarty metrics, and then actually create the survey instruments by which they'll measure whether they've achieved those or not. Is sort of how we think about the context setting for a lot of these processes. Again, I'm not sure, I mentioned at the beginning, I'm not sure what I'm allowed to share. There may or may not be a new youth PB process in New York City that'll be announced soon. And as part of that thing that may or may not exist, we also were partnering with folks who are doing this work already. So in New York City specifically, there are a lot of youth-led groups who are tackling these conversations outside of PB. I think about Integrate NYC, I think about Teens Take Charge, I think about Girls for Gender Equity, and countless other folks who are already doing this work. And we are just, supplying the PB container to add some more teeth to the already stellar work happening in New York City.
So exciting. Question from the Zoom from Lynn. What steps have you taken to make sure that voices that are often underrepresented in decision making here in Minnesota, that would be Black, Brown, and Indigenous voices, are part of the conversation and decision making?
So I'll take this from our perspective, from Borough Hall's perspective, not just with participatory budgeting, but with all of our allocations for funding. We view all of our distributions through an equity lens. So if you're talking about PB in the schools that were previously selected are inordinately schools that are in communities of color, that are vast majority are Title I schools. So we're being selective in which schools we want to engage with through the process. And that in turn ensures that it's the participants are Black and Brown voices, and trying to empower them in their schools and their communities. That said, there have been challenges. The first year we did participatory budgeting in Park Slope, there's a series of 5 schools on one campus. One was like 95% white. The others were majority minority. So trying to navigate the power dynamics in the school was challenging, and the PB project handled most of that, and they did a great job on that to ensure that all voices were being heard. And I think just having those difficult conversations at a young age empowers our young people to think more broadly than the school that they're in, so that can be translated out into the community more further afield.
Yeah, the best strategy I've seen to engage folks who were traditionally left out is to pay people and hire folks to work on it. When we have a group of volunteers, the folks that show up are folks who have the time and resources to volunteer and be committed to it. When we start paying folks, that's when we really see people who, may need a job or may not have time to just spend volunteering. And so that I think is, and also, if they're doing work, if they're adding value, then they deserve to be paid for it. So that's the best strategy I've seen to including Black, Indigenous people of color.
I think in the school setting, we're talking about ensuring that all of our students are engaged in the process. And so one of the things that I started off doing is really having people be intentional about how are we creating a space for our CBT or ESS students to come. So those are sometimes students who are in wheelchairs or need have a personal aid or assistant. So ensuring that when they vote, and students who are autistic, right, that they have a very quiet space where they come in and have a period designated for them to come in and be able to vote. We have about 82 different languages spoken in Phoenix Union. We have the highest refugee population, highest migrant population, highest McKinney-Vento, which is homeless, highest foster. We're right in the urban area of Phoenix. And so also ensuring that many of our volunteers speak multiple languages. We don't have people that speak all 82, but we have translators available. One of our schools, Central High School, who has one of the highest refugee populations, the students who were leading the work on their own decided, this wasn't, I would love to take credit for this idea. They decided that on the vote day, they wore name tags and it said, how can I help you, in many of the different languages that are represented by their students. And so it was also a way to make sure that the language and the ballot and information was available in multiple languages, but that students came to the polling station already educated of what the ballot proposals were and knew that they could go to somebody who spoke their language to answer questions. We offered, again, because I wanted this to be like real life, we offered early voting. So in some cases, there was a day where one of the campuses was voting on the statewide student government conference. And so I just talked about, if you know that a group of students is going to be away on a field trip, like let's offer early voting. And so we were very professional about it. It had to be closed in an envelope, and on the day of voting, they could be dropped off and we would count them. So we offer early voting. We'll go to classrooms if we need to do a little bit more instruction and the students can't come to the voting station. But also about that data. Like every year for every school, I talk about what their voter turnout rate is, and that ended up creating this energy and excitement about wanting to have the best voter turnout rate. One of our campuses that had a 99% voter turnout rate, they're like, well, that's because those 2 students were absent. So don't we have 100%? And I said, no, because you could have had them vote early, right? And that's real life. If they didn't show up on that day, they knew it wasn't important. We had a student at one of our schools who, we also stay open, our polling booths stay open an hour after school in case a student, for whatever reason, wasn't able to vote during the school day and didn't have an early ballot. And I remember as we were shutting down at Carl Hayden, this student like running in, like with sweat pouring down because he wanted to make sure to vote and he wanted his voice to count. So it's really creating that excitement and energy that students want to vote and they want to be there and they have multiple opportunities to be engaged.
That's amazing. A couple other questions from the panel from Luke and Kim. So let's assume a given school or school district buys into PB and allocates the budget. What are the biggest challenges facing the school community, students, teachers, and parents? as they seek to implement the PB program, both generally and specifically in the time of COVID-19?
I think generally, at least in my school district and in Arizona, there's a lot of focus on academics. And so finding the time, dedicated time where students can come together that is not pulling them away from their academic time. We were lucky to have an advisory program, and so we use that space for all of our workshopping, and then we use our district late start. But the other thing I started to do when we were still having some challenges, because I wanted, usually advisory is a time for tutoring and additional support, is really also aligning all of the strategies and learning of participatory budgeting to our academic content. And it's actually pretty simple to do. It takes some time, but you can align it to health curriculum standards, social studies, English. And so taking the time to do that helped our teachers understand that there was an opportunity for students to still learn what was happening as far as the academics, but in a different way. And they became more supportive of allowing students that time. I think for us, that was my biggest challenge, is getting the buy-in from folks to allow students to miss space. Of course, there's lots of other different challenges along the way. When you think about a vote day, we have rules with our unions about you can only have like one assembly per semester. And so we have a thing called campus committee that the union leaders are involved in, and they have to approve any schedule changes. That does create a challenge because there's times where they don't want a vote day to be the day that we need it to be, because I have 20 schools voting. And so we're really working closely and making sure that they're meeting with all of those leadership groups and getting buy-in from them to have some flexibility to pull students.
Great. One thing that I'll throw in there, is we were finishing up the Safe Schools process this year when the school shut down in March. So we were lucky enough to be far enough along in the process that we had already done proposal development and ballot creation that we were able to quickly pivot to online voting just using like easy Google Docs. And the principals and teachers that we're working with were able to make it a part of like an assignment through their online teaching curriculum, that we were able to like get those votes in and get people engaged. So that's one way we were able to do it.
Yeah, if I could like put a bug in people's ear to just like make voting extra credit, like young people in high school for some reason love extra credit. I mean, obviously jobs are great, but like I've seen the extra credit hook work like nearly 100%, like so well. I think the other thing is in person is so powerful. Like I would go to a school, I'd figure out when their lunchtime was with a stack of ballots, and like as young people were waiting in line for their food, I'd be like, here, fill this out, here, fill this out. And then as they were leaving, they would drop it off in the box. We gave out some t-shirts, and we got like, I don't know, hundreds, sometimes thousands of votes in a few hours. So COVID-19 poses a real, almost existential issue to how we generally strategize around PB, where in person is the best way that we solve this equity issue, right? We would bring the process to where people already were, and we always talked about that. Now that when folks became remote, when folks suddenly in person was super constrained, I think part of what happened is we shifted here at Coro our program to not just be youth engagement, but for the young people that have had a year, 2 years, some 3 years experience in PB, now to put their minds to say, how do we still do this equitably? How do we still find the channels where we can run a PB process without having to be in front of each other? We had young people split up and think about the different mechanisms of PB. And I think over the summer, they really created this engine of virtual engagement that they're measuring along different equity measures, that they're learning and extracting learnings from across different channels of engagement, designing virtual Zoom idea collection sessions, setting up a texting bot for folks that want to engage that way, and ensuring that no matter how a participant engages with us, they're going to have the same experience, whether they're on a Zoom call or whether they're on their phone or whether they're calling us and having a conversation with them. So that's some of how we've thought about, and we mapped out what we did is map out all the different touch points of a PB process along a few different axes. This is like a little nerdy, but we did like folks' mobility on one axis and folks' relationship to technology, whether they like had a really good relationship with it or they were tech averse. And we mapped out what currently exists in PB processes and then introduced the constraints and figured out how we would still meet people where they were at, just in a different way.
Yeah, Elizabeth stole my answer. So,
All right.
no, just the we were lucky to be further along in the process, and I think that I was really pleased that we continued to move it along through a virtual voting platform, because everywhere else in New York City just shut it down completely, and we were able to the BP is thrilled to be able to use technology in ways that empower engagement. So when we pitched him the idea of a virtual voting idea system, he was on board 100%. So he was very, very excited to be able to show that flexibility and use that as a demonstration for what's possible more broadly in civics across the city and across the country.
Great. So we have time for a couple more questions. I see a couple on Zoom here. So I'm curious to know if people use PB as a means to teach about things like voter suppression or people not being allowed to vote due to citizenship or felony status, or talking about how kids who are pushed out or suspended, or kids who don't get to vote, for example. So do you use PB to talk about broader democracy reform and civic engagement? And have you seen examples of that?
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about that. I think so PB largely is informal, except now in New York City where it's part of the city charter, thanks to a very successful organizing campaign. In most places, it's not a law. It's not at most, it's like a policy or a program that happens. And what comes with that informality is the ability to take what you will from the general election process and apply it, and also like to innovate within it. So it's no secret that voting ages are lowered generally in PB processes. Some PB processes have no lower voting ages. And also a lot of things like citizenship status, or felony status, or immigration status aren't considered when you're voting, right? Folks take away those requirements in order to increase accessibility to the process. And so when we have those conversations, these things do come up. I have seen when we partner with specific organizations that are doing education campaigns related to voter suppression or doing education campaigns related to the school to prison pipeline, often they use that as a hook and a jumping off point to really talk about why young people need more power and why PB is a really good thing. So while there's certain, in my experience, there hasn't been a PB process centered in concert with those things. But depending on who your audience is in any given engagement, it makes a lot of sense to make those connections. We start a lot of our PB engagements with just a general discussion and doing a temperature check of what's on people's minds. We do a spectrum exercise where we say a statement, and if you agree, you go to this side of the room, or if you disagree, you go to this side of the room. Or in the times of COVID, you give a thumbs up or a thumb down into the screen. And that sometimes surfaces and helps us understand what's on the minds of the folks we're engaging in this moment, and how that informs the idea collection that we do.
I think just to add to that, I agree with everything Francesco said, but I think our role as educators oftentimes is to facilitate thinking. We don't have to have the answers, but if we put a thought out there, the students are actually going to question this, and then it creates that opportunity where you can make those connections. And so, early on, I think about students saying, well, who can vote? And so then we can talk about, well, who can vote in our elections? Do you know who's voting? And we talk about that, and then talk about why it's so important to make sure that we're making voting accessible to all students. And when we think about voter turnout rate, in the school setting and then compare that. We've obviously been doing this for a few years, so it's easy for them to compare it with elections that are happening at the city level, state level, and federal level. And they can see like, we had a better turnout rate from the last presidential election. And they're really impressed by that. But talking specifically about which those students about who are suspended, that came up. Students asked about that. How can we make sure that those students are allowed to vote because they're not in an English class at that campus? They were going through English class. So I said, so what are you going to do to make sure that students in in-school suspension, how are you going to schedule them to vote? Or do you want to do early voting? But I just wanted to throw that out there. I think anytime you can make a connection to real world and to these topics that are so relevant and important, we should do that. And sometimes it's just with us asking those questions and allowing students to think through that, ask more questions, and come up with how they want to respond and what they want to do in their setting.
Amazing. Thank you all so much. So one last question, and I'm going to ask you all, and also going to ask everybody on Zoom and on Facebook to type in the chat or in the comments. And that is, what is your vision for justice? So in this moment, as participatory democracy practitioners, what is your vision for justice?
That's a really tough question. And I probably would answer that different with whatever I'm thinking about. But what comes to mind in this moment would be really about like creating spaces where inclusion, diversity, and equity is the norm. Spaces where stakeholders all have a voice at the decision-making table, not where we just solicit feedback. A lot of times I see lots of instances where they'll receive, ask for feedback, but literally having a voice at the decision-making table, having an opportunity to create and innovate alongside with your district leadership. Yeah, just there, I guess.
I would look at it from, being the government side of this. Is the vision of justice needs to be focused around, from our perspective, on resource allocation. We are seeing communities that are just being overlooked repeatedly in the types of resources that they're being allocated. So from a school PB process, we would love to see this be universally applied across New York City. But that has to come with the necessary resources and the necessary buy-in from the political leaders. One of the challenges is that, you have 51 council members, you have 5 borough presidents, you have 3 citywide elected officials in New York City, and not all of them are buy into this process. So the education of getting them hooked on this idea of using dollars and real decisions to make it real for young people and to get them to become civically engaged has to be a huge selling point. So the vision of justice from our perspective is that all these resources, that we're not being selective in the schools that we apply these to. Any school that should want to be able to participate should be able to participate, but also, but that can't be done without the broader political will across the city.
And my vision is for young people to take over the cities that they live in. It's always been for me like empowering young people to be able to shape their future. So that means having pathways to fulfilling careers for young people, whatever those may be. Empowering young people to be the experts that solve their issues with PB, and giving them resources to do that stuff. And also just cultivating an environment in a city where young people are motivated to take advantage of all the opportunities presented to them. That's sort of my vision for justice right now in this moment. That's what speaks to me.
That is amazing. Thank you all so much for coming and sharing your experiences. And thank you to everyone on Zoom and on Facebook Live. I'll share my vision for justice is a place where community-led decision-making is the norm and not the exception, a place where we have real democracy. It's youth-led, so they're where we trust people to be experts in their own lived experiences. So this series is called Visions for Justice because we're excited about how community-led decision-making can help us build a more just future where all of us can be truly safe. This is the second in a series. The next one is going to be in 2 weeks on September 16th, where we're going to be talking about democracy beyond elections and more participatory practices. So learning more about participatory policymaking and how we're moving that work forward. And yeah, thank you all so much. Check us out on participatorybudgeting.org, Facebook, and we'll see you in a couple weeks. Thank you.
Thanks, team.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Great panel.
Yeah.
Thanks, Elizabeth.
Thank you. Thank you all.